I've always loved living in a coastal town. There's something comforting about the constant hum of the ocean and the smell of salt in the air. On the weekends, the streets buzz with the energy of tourists and locals alike, especially in the summer. The restaurants are full, the bars are lively, and the beaches are packed with sun-kissed faces enjoying the simple pleasures of life. It's the kind of place where everyone seems to know each other, and you can always count on running into someone familiar, no matter where you go. For years, I had a tight-knit group of friends I'd meet up with almost every weekend. We'd bar hop, maybe grab a bite to eat, or sometimes just stroll along the boardwalk talking about life. But recently, things have changed. A lot of my friends started settling down, getting married, or moving out of town for new jobs. Suddenly, the once crowded group shrunk to just a few of us. It wasn't quite the same anymore, and to be honest, I started feeling a little lonely. One Saturday night, the few of us that were still around decided to hit the usual spots. It was just me, Rachel, and Will, a quiet night compared to the wild evenings we used to have. We found a small, dimly lit bar off the main strip, the kind of place that's more for locals than tourists. It wasn't our usual spot, but we wanted something low-key. As we were sitting at a corner table, nursing our drinks and chatting about nothing in particular, two men approached us. One of them, Tony, was tall and lean, with sharp features and an easygoing grin. The other, Mark, was quieter, with dark hair that fell into his eyes and a more serious demeanor. Tony introduced himself, cracking a few jokes, while Mark hung back, watching the conversation with a subtle intensity. I could feel Mark's gaze on me throughout the night. He didn't say much at first, but every now and then, he'd make a comment or ask a question that showed he was paying close attention. Eventually, the conversation flowed, and we ended up talking more and more. There was something about him that intrigued me, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. We exchanged numbers at the end of the night, and I didn't think much of it. People in a small town like ours are always swapping numbers with new faces. But the next weekend, when my plans with Rachel and Will fell through, I found myself alone at home with no idea what to do. Out of the blue, I got a message from Mark, asking if I wanted to grab a drink. Normally, I'd be cautious about going out with someone I didn't know too well, but I figured I'd already met him once with friends. What's the harm in one more casual night out? He picked me up that evening, and we went to another small bar on the outskirts of town. It was even quieter than the place we met the week before, almost eerily so. The lights were dim, casting long shadows across the room, and the few patrons inside seemed lost in their own worlds. Mark seemed a little more relaxed this time, more talkative. He ordered us both drinks, and we settled into easy conversation. As the night wore on, I started feeling off. I wasn't sure if it was the alcohol or the strange vibe in the bar, but something wasn't right. My head felt heavy, and my thoughts started to blur together. I remember Mark ordering more drinks, but I could barely keep track of the conversation anymore. The room started spinning, and then everything went black. When I woke up, I wasn't in the bar anymore. At first, I couldn't make sense of my surroundings. I was lying on a cold, hard surface, the air around me thick with the smell of dampness and something else, something metallic, like blood. Panic shot through me, and I shot up, my heart pounding in my chest as I struggled to get my bearings. The room was dark, the only light coming from a small window high up on the wall. It wasn't the soft, welcoming glow of dawn, though. It was harsh, artificial, like a streetlight casting an eerie yellow tint over everything. I looked around and realized I was in some kind of basement. The walls were concrete, and there was barely any furniture, a single wooden chair and a table, both old and worn. I scrambled to my feet, my head still throbbing from whatever had happened the night before. My mind raced. How had I gotten here? Where was I? And more importantly, where was Mark? I frantically searched my pockets for my phone, my wallet, anything. But they were empty. Fear coursed through me as I realized I was completely alone, and without a way to call for help. My first instinct was to run, but I didn't even know where the door was. I started towards the narrow staircase on the other side of the room, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. Just as I reached the bottom of the stairs, I heard a noise from above, footsteps. My heart nearly stopped. I froze, hoping whoever it was hadn't heard me. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until the door at the top of the stairs creaked open, and there stood Mark. For a moment, relief washed over me. Maybe he had found me passed out and brought me here to recover, I thought. Maybe I had just had too much to drink, and all of this was some kind of misunderstanding. But as soon as I saw the look on his face, that brief flicker of hope vanished. Mark's expression was cold, calculated. He stood there, blocking the doorway, his hand resting in his jacket pocket as if he was holding something. My mind immediately jumped to the worst conclusions. I took a step back, trying to keep my voice steady as I asked, "What's going on, Mark? Why am I here?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow step down the stairs, his eyes never leaving mine. "You were pretty out of it last night," he said, his voice low and devoid of any warmth. "I brought you back here to make sure you were safe." I didn't believe him for a second. "I want to go home," I said firmly, backing away further as he descended another step. "No." Mark's smile was a thin, humorless line. "You're not going anywhere." It was then that I saw the glint of something metal in his hand, a knife. My heart raced, my instincts screaming at me to run, but I was trapped. The stairs were blocked, and there were no other exits in sight. I don't know how I managed to keep my voice from shaking as I said, "Mark, please, just let me go. I won't tell anyone. Just let me leave." But Mark didn't seem to care about what I said. He stepped closer, raising the knife ever so slightly, and I knew I had to act fast. In a flash, I lunged towards him, grabbing the hand holding the knife and twisting it with all my strength. He was stronger than I expected, but adrenaline was on my side. I managed to pry the knife from his grip, and as soon as I had it, I turned and bolted for the stairs. I didn't look back, I just ran. Somehow, I made it out of the house and into the street. I was barefoot, disoriented, and terrified, but I didn't stop running until I found a gas station a few blocks away. Breathless and shaking, I called my brother, and he came to pick me up. The next morning, I went straight to the hospital. Tests revealed what I had suspected. Rohypnol, the date rape drug, had been in my system. Mark had drugged me. I'm pressing charges against him now. It's been a long process, and while I don't know how it will end, I do know one thing: I'm never letting my guard down again. Ben de NOI. Teep TUC. ChatGPT de NOI. ChatGPT. Part 2, The Aftermath. The next few days were a blur. I spent most of my time in a daze, trying to process everything that had happened. I kept replaying the night in my head, wondering how I had missed the signs, how I had let things go so far. The realization that I had come so close to something unthinkable sent chills down my spine, even now, weeks later. After the hospital visit, I went straight to the police. I wasn't sure what I was hoping for. Maybe that they'd arrest Mark right away, or that they'd tell me I wasn't crazy, that what I had experienced was real and as terrifying as it felt. But things didn't work out quite the way I expected. The officers were polite, but there was a certain detachment in the way they questioned me, as if they'd heard similar stories 100 times before. They took my statement, nodding along as I described the night, the drinks, the blackout, waking up in that dark room, the knife, the escape. When I told them about the Rohypnol in my system, I thought that would be the turning point. Surely, with evidence of a drug in my body, they'd take action. But their response was more measured than I'd hoped. They asked me if I had any solid proof that Mark had drugged me. Could I be sure I hadn't accidentally taken something myself? Was there any chance someone else had spiked my drink? They said they'd investigate, but the undertone was clear. Unless there was more evidence, their hands were tied. It was infuriating. I had been drugged, abducted, and threatened with a knife, yet without concrete proof beyond my word and the test results. It felt like I was shouting into the wind. I left the station feeling more frustrated than reassured. My brother David was my rock during this time. He had been furious when he picked me up from that gas station, ready to hunt Mark down himself. But I managed to calm him down, and now he was doing everything he could to help me navigate the next steps. We contacted a lawyer, someone David knew through work, to see what options we had. That's when I learned about the possibility of a civil lawsuit. The lawyer, Jane, was sharp and compassionate. She explained that while the criminal case might be difficult to prove without more evidence, a civil suit could give us another avenue to hold Mark accountable. It wouldn't be easy. Mark's defense would likely hinge on the fact that there were no witnesses, and I had no clear memory of most of the night. But Jane believed we had a strong case, especially with the Rohypnol in my system. The legal process was grueling. Every time I had to recount what happened, it felt like I was reliving that night all over again. I had to sit through depositions, where Mark's lawyer grilled me on every detail. They tried to poke holes in my story, asking why I went out with him in the first place, why I didn't call for help sooner, why I hadn't noticed something was wrong earlier in the night. It was exhausting, emotionally draining. But the worst part was seeing Mark in the courtroom. He was calm, collected, and smug. He denied everything, of course. According to him, I had simply had too much to drink, and he had been the good guy, trying to take care of me. His story painted me as reckless and irresponsible, as if everything that happened was somehow my fault. At times, I started to doubt myself. What if I had overreacted? What if it wasn't as bad as I remembered? But then I'd think back to that moment in the basement, the way he blocked the door, the coldness in his eyes as he held that knife. No, I wasn't imagining things. I knew what had happened. In the meantime, I tried to piece my life back together. I quit going out to bars for a while, unable to shake the paranoia that every stranger I met might have ill intentions. Even in my own home, I didn't feel completely safe. I installed new locks on all the doors and kept a knife in my bedside table, just in case. Sleeping was hard, though. I'd lie awake, my mind racing, jumping at every little sound outside the window. Rachel and Will were supportive, but I could tell they didn't fully understand. They'd tell me how lucky I was to have gotten out when I did, how things could have been so much worse. And while I knew they were right, their words didn't make me feel better. Yes, I had escaped, but the damage had already been done. My sense of security had been shattered, and no amount of "you're lucky" could change that. The court proceedings dragged on for months. Each time there was a new hearing or deposition, I felt a mixture of dread and determination. I wanted this to be over, but more than that, I wanted justice. I wanted Mark to pay for what he had done, not just to me, but for whatever else he might have done to other women in the past, or could do in the future. One day, during one of the hearings, something unexpected happened. Mark's lawyer had been relentlessly questioning me, trying to trip me up on small details. I was on the verge of breaking down when Jane stood up and asked to submit new evidence, a set of security footage from the bar that night. I hadn't known about the footage. Apparently, Jane had managed to track down the owner of the bar, who had initially been reluctant to share the tapes. But after some legal pressure, he handed them over. The footage showed Mark and me sitting at the bar, drinking. It wasn't incriminating at first glance, but then Jane pointed out a critical moment. As I got up to use the restroom, Mark could be seen slipping something into my drink. My heart stopped when I saw it. There it was, in grainy black and white footage, the proof I had been waiting for. Mark had drugged me. The mood in the courtroom shifted after that. Mark's lawyer quickly tried to downplay the footage, saying it was inconclusive, that it didn't prove what he had slipped into my drink. But everyone knew what had happened. The case was no longer just about my word against his. In the weeks that followed, the case moved rapidly toward settlement. Mark, now facing the reality of the evidence against him, agreed to a civil settlement to avoid a drawn-out trial. He didn't admit guilt, of course, but the settlement was substantial enough to feel like a victory. It wasn't the full justice I had wanted, but it was something. And knowing that Mark was finally being held accountable, even in this small way, brought me some relief. As the case came to a close, I began to feel like I could finally start to heal. The nightmares still come sometimes, and I'm still more cautious than I used to be, but I'm getting there. Slowly, I'm reclaiming my life, piece by piece. Looking back, I realize how easily things could have gone differently. If I hadn't fought back, if I hadn't escaped, I might not be here to tell this story. But I am, and I'm stronger for it. And while Mark may have tried to break me, he failed. I'm still here, and I'm still fighting. I've always been the kind of person who finds peace in nature, especially in the quiet solitude of the woods near my home in Monson, Pennsylvania. My family and I moved here last year, wanting to escape the hectic city life. Monson was supposed to be the perfect place, small, quiet, with dense forests that seemed to stretch on forever. In the summer, when the days were long and the air was warm, I often took my mountain bike out for a ride along the forest trails near our house. It was my way of clearing my head, getting some exercise, and reconnecting with the calm that the woods offered. That afternoon was like any other, or so I thought. The sky was overcast, and the air felt heavy, like the world was holding its breath before a storm. But I wasn't worried about the weather. I planned on a quick half-hour ride, nothing too intense, just enough to stretch my legs before the rain came. I grabbed my helmet, jumped on my bike, and headed out, telling myself I'd be back before the storm hit. The trail I took that day was one I knew well. It started just beyond the edge of our property and wound its way deep into the forest, eventually leading to a small clearing where I usually stopped for a break before turning back. I loved this part of the trail. The tall trees created a canopy overhead, casting a cool, comforting shadow on the path below. The only sounds were the crunch of gravel under my tires, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the distant call of birds. It was peaceful, almost hypnotic. As I pedaled up the steep incline toward the clearing, I felt the first hint of unease. Maybe it was the way the light filtered through the clouds, casting an eerie grayish hue over everything, or maybe it was the stillness in the air that unsettled me. Whatever it was, I shook it off, pushing forward, determined to reach the clearing before turning back. When I finally made it to the top, I was out of breath and sweating. I leaned my bike against a tree and took a moment to rest. The clearing was just as I remembered it, quiet, isolated, surrounded by towering trees. But something was different today. The usual sounds of the forest were gone. No wind, no birds, no rustling leaves. Just silence. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured the animals had sensed the incoming rain and were hunkering down somewhere. But as the silence stretched on, it began to gnaw at me. It wasn't just quiet, it was unnaturally quiet, like the entire forest was holding its breath. My heartbeat quickened, and a sense of unease crept over me. And then I heard it. A faint crack. Like a twig snapping underfoot. I froze, my eyes darting around the clearing. There was no one else on the trail. I hadn't seen another person since I left the house. But the sound was unmistakable, coming from just beyond the tree line. I squinted, trying to make out anything in the shadows of the trees. My pulse was pounding in my ears now, making it hard to focus. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. A dark shape, hunched over, partially obscured by the trees. It wasn't moving, but it was there, crouched low to the ground. It didn't look like an animal, though. It was too still, too human. But not quite. I stared, my breath caught in my throat, waiting for it to move. Seconds passed, then a minute, and the figure remained motionless. The longer I looked, the more I could make out its shape. Long limbs, unnaturally thin, its skin pale against the dark backdrop of the forest. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't rationalize it. That's when the rain started. A few fat drops splattered onto the ground, quickly followed by a downpour. The sudden sound of the rain hitting the leaves shattered the silence, but instead of bringing relief, it heightened my fear. I couldn't stay here. I had to go. Without taking my eyes off the figure, I scrambled for my bike, my hands shaking as I fumbled to grab the handlebars. The rain made the ground slick, and my feet slipped on the muddy path as I mounted the bike. I glanced back toward the tree line one last time, hoping, praying, that whatever I'd seen had vanished. But it was still there, still crouching, still watching. And then it moved. Just a slight shift, almost imperceptible, but enough to send a jolt of terror through me. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I pushed off and started pedaling as fast as I could, the tires of my bike slipping and sliding on the wet trail. The rain pelted my face, blurring my vision, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there. The ride back down the hill was a blur. The path twisted and turned, but I barely registered it. All I could think about was putting as much distance between me and that thing as possible. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every instinct in my body told me to keep going, to not stop until I was safe. By the time I reached the bottom of the trail, I was soaked to the bone, my heart racing. I didn't slow down until I was back in my yard, skidding to a stop near the garage. My hands were trembling as I threw my bike into the shed, not caring where it landed. I ran inside, dripping water all over the floor. My parents were in the living room, watching TV, oblivious to the storm outside. I could hear the murmur of their voices, but I didn't stop to talk to them. I couldn't. I headed straight for my room, my mind still reeling from what I'd seen. Once I was alone, I collapsed onto my bed, trying to steady my breathing. It was just my imagination, I told myself. The rain, the shadows, they'd all played tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something had been out there, watching me. And I had a terrible feeling it wasn't finished with me yet. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, even after I'd been safely home for hours. My heart was still pounding, and my mind kept replaying what I had seen in the woods, the dark figure, the unnerving silence, and the way it had moved, just enough to let me know it was aware of me. That night, after drying off and calming down a bit, I tried to convince myself that it was all just in my head. Shadows, rain, an overactive imagination, those were logical explanations for what I had seen. But deep down, a lingering dread settled in the pit of my stomach, a constant reminder that something unnatural had been out there. Still, I pushed those thoughts aside, not wanting to admit to myself, let alone anyone else, what I had really felt in the woods. Dinner passed uneventfully. My parents didn't seem to notice how quiet I was, and I didn't offer any details about my ride, partly because I didn't want to sound crazy and partly because I didn't even know how to describe what had happened. The more I thought about it, the more surreal the experience became, like a fading memory from a bad dream. I went to bed early, but sleep didn't come easily. My mind was racing, replaying the scene over and over again. Each time, I saw the dark figure more clearly, the long, skeletal limbs, the pale skin, the way it had been crouching, as if it were ready to pounce at any moment. I couldn't help but wonder if it had followed me. The thought sent a chill through me, and I had to get up to check the windows, just to be sure they were locked. Finally, exhaustion won, and I drifted off to sleep. But rest didn't bring any relief. Instead, the nightmare began. In my dream, I was back in the woods, standing at the edge of the clearing. Everything was the same as before, the trees towering around me, the oppressive silence hanging in the air. But this time, I wasn't alone. The figure was there, lurking at the far end of the clearing, its pale skin glowing faintly in the dim light. It wasn't crouching anymore. It was standing tall and gaunt, its hollow eyes fixed on me. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of lead, rooted to the ground as the creature started to move toward me. It was slow at first, almost deliberate, as if it was savoring the moment. But then it quickened, its long limbs stretching unnaturally, closing the distance between us far too quickly. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was tight, my chest heavy with terror. All I could do was watch as the thing reached me, its bony fingers curling around my arm, cold and unyielding. I could feel its breath on my neck, icy and rancid, as it leaned in closer, its hollow eyes inches from mine. I woke up with a start, gasping for air, my heart hammering in my chest. It took me a moment to realize I was back in my room, safe under the covers. But the fear lingered, so vivid and real that I could still feel the creature's touch on my arm. I glanced at the clock. It was 3:12 a.m., the witching hour, as they called it. The time when the veil between worlds was said to be the thinnest. My skin crawled with unease, and I sat up, glancing around the room. The shadows cast by the streetlight outside seemed darker than usual, more menacing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though I knew that was impossible. But then I heard it. A faint scratching sound, like nails dragging across wood. It was coming from the window. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was subtle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. It was real. My eyes darted to the window, and I could barely make out the outline of something standing just outside. A tall, thin figure. My heart stopped. It was back. I sat there, paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even breathe properly. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing, but there was no explanation. The figure outside the window was too real, too present to be a figment of my imagination. And then, the scratching stopped. For a few seconds, there was silence again, and I thought, maybe hoped, that it was over. But then the window began to rattle, softly at first, then more violently, as if something, or someone, was trying to open it. My blood ran cold. I knew I had locked it earlier, but the rattling continued, more persistent now, as if the creature outside was testing the lock, trying to find a way in. I bolted out of bed, my legs shaky, and grabbed the first thing I could find, a heavy book from my desk. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was better than nothing. Slowly, I crept toward the window, my breath shallow, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it could hear me. The rattling stopped just as I reached the window. I stood there, staring at the curtains, too afraid to pull them back. My hand hovered over the fabric, trembling. Part of me didn't want to see what was outside, but I had to know. I had to be sure. I yanked the curtain open. Nothing. The window was closed, locked just as I had left it. There was no sign of the figure, no scratches on the glass, no indication that anything had been there at all. But I knew what I had heard. I knew what I had seen. I backed away from the window, my skin still crawling with the lingering sensation of being watched. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Was it possible that I was still dreaming? That the nightmare hadn't ended when I woke up? But no. I was wide awake, and the fear was all too real. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat in bed, clutching the book like a lifeline, my eyes darting to the window every few minutes, expecting to see that figure return. But the rest of the night passed in silence. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the clouds, I was exhausted, but relieved that the nightmare, whatever it had been, seemed to be over. The next morning, I told myself it was all just a bad dream, a vivid, terrifying hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. But when I went outside to get my bike from the shed, I saw them. Footprints. Wet, muddy footprints, leading from the edge of the woods to my window. They were large, humanoid, but twisted, with long, claw-like toes. I stood there, staring at them in disbelief, my heart pounding in my chest. The creature from the woods wasn't a figment of my imagination. It was real, and it knew where I lived. It was late July, a hot and humid summer in Savannah, Georgia. My parents had gone on their annual vacation to the mountains, leaving me to watch over the house for a week. Their place is a charming, old southern home perched on the edge of a quiet canal. It's one of those places that feels like it's isolated from the rest of the world, especially in the late hours when the humidity settles in, and the sounds of the marshland become the only music in the night. The house itself is big, almost too big for one person, even though I wasn't entirely alone. I had 2 cats, Max and Leo, who roamed the hallways like they owned the place. They were my only real company. Well, them and Jane. Jane, my girlfriend, had decided to join me for the weekend. We'd been together for a while, and this was the first time she'd stay over at my parents' place. The plan was simple, nothing too wild, just us, a few drinks, and the hot tub out back. The yard, overlooking the canal, had a peaceful view. My dad's Boston whaler sat anchored at the small dock, alongside 2 jet skis we hadn't used in months. The canal was usually still at night, only occasionally disturbed by a passing boat or a wayward pelican. That evening, after a nice dinner in town, Jane and I slipped into the hot tub. The heat of the water was perfect, and the sounds of cicadas buzzing in the distance created a calm, almost hypnotic atmosphere. The moonlight glistened off the water in the canal, and for a while, we just sat there in silence, enjoying the stillness of it all. That's when I heard it, a faint splash, the unmistakable sound of something moving through the water. I turned my head, squinting into the darkness. There, just barely visible under the pale moonlight, was the silhouette of a man in a kayak, paddling slowly down the canal. "Do you see that?" I whispered to Jane. She turned her head, following my gaze. "Yeah, that's weird. Who kayaks this late?" It was strange, but Savannah was full of eccentric people. I figured he was just someone out enjoying a late-night paddle. Still, something about it seemed off. The man wasn't just paddling casually. His strokes were deliberate, almost too slow, like he was taking his time, watching, observing. But I shrugged it off. This was a quiet neighborhood. Weird things didn't happen here. "He's probably just lost," I said, trying to shake off the eerie feeling creeping up my spine. Jane didn't seem convinced, but we both turned our attention back to the warmth of the hot tub, letting the incident slip from our minds. After an hour or so, we decided to head inside. The house was dark and quiet, with the occasional creak from the old wooden floors beneath our feet. I led Jane upstairs to my room, the one with the best view of the canal. We were just about to call it a night when I saw it, a flash of white light flickering through the window. "What the hell was that?" Jane asked, startled. I walked over to the window and peered out. There, standing on the dock, was the man from the kayak. He was holding a flashlight, waving it toward the house. My heart started racing. "I think he's trying to get our attention," I said, my voice low. Jane moved next to me, looking out through the window. The man raised the flashlight again, waving it back and forth like some kind of signal. "Do you think he needs help?" she asked, her voice unsure. I wasn't sure what to think. Something about it felt wrong. Why would someone be paddling out here so late? And why was he standing on our dock? But the logical part of my brain told me he might be in trouble. Maybe he'd fallen out of his kayak, or hurt himself. "I'll go see what he wants," I said, grabbing a hoodie and slipping on some shoes. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" Jane asked, her hand resting on my arm. I hesitated. "I'll be quick. Stay here." I headed downstairs, my heart pounding harder with each step. As I opened the sliding glass door that led to the yard, the humid night air hit me like a wall. I could see the man standing there, his figure outlined by the dim light from his flashlight. "Hey!" I called out, trying to sound confident. "What's going on?" He didn't respond right away, just stood there, his face hidden by the shadows. Then he spoke, his voice raspy and low. "I'm hurt. I need help." I took a few steps closer, squinting to get a better look at him. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket despite the summer heat. Something about the way he stood, his posture, didn't seem like someone who was injured. My instincts screamed at me to turn around, but I ignored them. "What happened?" I asked, still maintaining some distance. He didn't answer my question directly. Instead, he took a step forward, his flashlight pointed toward my face now, blinding me for a second. My heart was pounding in my ears. Something wasn't right. Then, from above, I heard Jane's voice, sharp and panicked. "Get back in the house! Now!" I spun around, just in time to see her standing at the window, pointing toward the canal. My blood ran cold as I turned back toward the man. He wasn't on the dock anymore. He was running, charging straight toward me. Without thinking, I bolted back toward the house, my legs moving faster than they ever had. I slammed the sliding door shut just as the man reached it, his fists pounding on the glass. The impact sent vibrations through the entire door. My heart raced in my chest as I locked it, stumbling backward into the kitchen. I could hear Jane yelling from upstairs, her voice filled with terror. The man outside continued pounding on the door, his face now illuminated by the porch light. He was older than I had thought, his eyes wide with a manic, almost predatory gleam. This wasn't some injured kayaker. This was something else. "Call the police!" Jane screamed from above. I rushed to the stairs, my mind racing with fear, trying to figure out what to do next. Every instinct told me we were in serious danger, and I couldn't shake the thought that this man had been watching us, waiting for this moment. As I reached the top of the stairs, the pounding stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the noise. It hung in the air, thick and unsettling. I turned back to the window, but the man was gone. But I knew in my gut this wasn't over. Not yet. For a moment, all I could hear was the thumping of my own heartbeat. Jane's frantic breathing came from behind me, and I turned to see her standing at the bedroom doorway, pale and wide-eyed. The pounding on the door had stopped, but the tension in the air hung thick, pressing in on us like a storm waiting to break. "He's gone," I said, more to convince myself than Jane. "No, he's not," Jane whispered. "I saw him. He's not hurt. He was running, and he was fast. Something's wrong. We need to call the police. Now." She was right, of course. I fumbled for my phone and quickly dialed 911. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone before I hit the call button. 911, what's your emergency?" I could barely speak. "There's a man outside our house. He's trying to get in. We need help." The dispatcher's voice remained calm, though I could hear the urgency behind her words. "Stay inside. Lock all doors and windows. Officers are on their way. Do not open the door for anyone until they arrive." "How long has he been there?" I glanced out the window again, half expecting to see the man lurking in the yard. The canal beyond the dock was eerily still, the moonlight casting long shadows across the water. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, somewhere, watching us. "Maybe 10 minutes, I replied, my voice shaking. "He said he was hurt, but then he chased me." "Stay calm," the dispatcher said. "Help is on the way. Are all your doors and windows locked?" I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Yeah. We locked everything." Jane was pacing nervously behind me, her hands running through her hair, eyes darting toward the window every few seconds. The cats, sensing the tension, had disappeared somewhere upstairs, their usual curiosity replaced with an almost unsettling quiet. Then, just as I was about to tell the dispatcher more, I heard it again, faint but unmistakable. The sound of paddles dipping into the water. My blood froze as I stepped closer to the window, careful not to make any noise. I could barely make it out, but there it was, moving slowly across the canal, the kayak. "Are you still there?" the dispatcher asked. "Yeah," I whispered. I think he's leaving. Stay inside until the officers arrive," she instructed firmly. "Even if you think it's safe, do not go outside." I hung up the phone and backed away from the window. "He's paddling away." Jane's eyes widened. "What do you mean? Is he really leaving?" I nodded. "I think so. I just saw the kayak." For a moment, we both stood there in stunned silence, unsure whether to feel relieved or more terrified. Why would he just leave like that? What was he doing in the first place? My mind raced with questions that had no answers. It felt too easy, too sudden. My gut told me this wasn't over. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. We sat on the edge of the bed, waiting for the police to arrive, listening for any sign that the man might come back. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind outside made my heart skip a beat. Jane sat close to me, her hand gripping mine tightly. Neither of us spoke. Then came a noise that sent my heart plummeting into my stomach, a loud thud from downstairs. It was as if something heavy had hit the side of the house. Jane gasped, and I jumped to my feet, grabbing the closest thing I could use as a weapon, a small knife from the desk drawer. "What was that?" Jane asked, her voice trembling. I don't know, I whispered. My mind raced through all the possibilities. Had the man come back? Was he trying to break in again? The silence that followed the thud was almost unbearable. I crept toward the window again, peering down into the yard. At first, everything seemed normal. The dock was empty, the canal still as ever. But as I looked closer, my breath caught in my throat. The kayak wasn't there anymore. It had disappeared. Suddenly, a scream pierced the air. Jane's scream. I whipped around to see her standing by the door, her eyes wide with terror. "He's in the house!" My blood turned to ice. "What? How? I saw him! Downstairs! He's inside!" My heart pounded so loudly I could barely think. The man had somehow gotten in, and now he was inside with us. I grabbed Jane's hand and pulled her toward the bedroom. "We need to barricade the door." We slammed the door shut and shoved a heavy dresser in front of it, both of us panting with fear and adrenaline. Jane was shaking, her face pale as she whispered, "What do we do?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we had to stay quiet and wait for the police. The silence in the house felt suffocating now, every second stretching into an eternity. My mind was spinning, trying to figure out how he'd gotten inside. Had we missed a window? A door? How could someone who seemed so weak and injured suddenly move so fast, so violently? Then footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming up the stairs. They echoed through the hallway, each step heavier than the last. My grip tightened on the knife, though I knew it wouldn't be much of a defense against whoever, or whatever, was out there. Jane clutched my arm, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. No sound, no movement. Just the unbearable silence of the unknown on the other side of that door. Then a voice. "Open the door." It was him. The same low, raspy voice I'd heard earlier by the dock. But there was something different about it now. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Neither of us moved. We stayed frozen, holding our breath, praying that he wouldn't break through. "I know you're in there," the voice continued, calm and unnerving. "You can't hide from me." My hand shook as I raised the knife, though I knew it wouldn't be enough. My only hope was that the police would get here in time. The doorknob rattled. Jane whimpered, clinging to my arm. And then, suddenly, the front door burst open downstairs, and we heard the unmistakable shouts of police officers. The man outside the door went silent. His footsteps retreated quickly, moving down the stairs. I felt a flood of relief wash over me as the pounding of footsteps and voices filled the house. The police had arrived. But when we finally worked up the courage to move the dresser and open the door, the man was gone. The officers searched the entire house, every room, every corner, but there was no sign of him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. They never found the kayak either. The officers told us that there had been no reports of a man matching his description in the area, and no one else along the canal had seen anything unusual that night. They chalked it up to a possible attempted break-in, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it, something darker. For weeks after, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. Who was he? What did he want? And how did he disappear so quickly? I never got any answers. And I never saw him again. But every time I hear the sound of water, every time the night is too quiet, I remember the man in the kayak. And I wonder if he's still out there, somewhere, waiting for the next moment to strike.